March 24, 1945. 22,000 feet above the cold German countryside, Franz Stigler gripped the controls of his Bf-109 as the engine coughed its final breath. The needles on the fuel gauge lay dead. Below him stretched miles of occupied fields, roads, and forests, every inch crawling with Allied forces pushing deeper into a dying Reich. Behind him sat an airfield he no longer had the power to reach. Around him, the sky belonged to the Americans, the wind clawed at the aircraft's canopy. The cold cut through his gloves, but it wasn't the altitude freezing his hands. It was the certainty of what came next. He had heard the warnings since the first months of the war. American pilots didn't just shoot you down, they waited for you to jump, circled your descent, and ended you before you touched the earth. That was the story, repeated by commanders, passed through barracks, believed without question. Mercy was a myth. Surrender meant death. The engine sputtered once more, then died completely. The propeller spun uselessly in the slipstream. Franz felt the aircraft lighten as it shifted into a powerless glide. No thrust. No sound except rushing wind and his own heartbeat. He angled the nose downward gently, trying to stretch the descent, trying to buy seconds. Far below, he spotted a captured Luftwaffe airfield, now American, filled with strange silhouettes of vehicles and aircraft. It was a runway, a chance, but also a trap. Even if he survived the landing, what waited? Capture? Humiliation? Or worse? He pictured his mother and younger sister in Bavaria. If he vanished, they would receive a cold note, missing in action. No reason, no details, only silence. Then, a flicker of movement in the corner of his mirror. Two silver glints grew larger, sharper, slicing through the sky with unmistakable purpose. P-51 Mustangs. Fast. Deadly. The best the Allies had. Franz's stomach turned to ice that he didn't bother reaching for the trigger. He couldn't fight. He could barely steer. He braced for the burst of gunfire that would rip his wings apart. The second stretched, cruel and slow, but death didn't come. Instead, one Mustang slid beside his wing, so close Franz could see the American pilot's goggles, the tight jawline, the calm expression. The pilot stared at him without anger, without triumph. Just watching. Judging. Thinking. Another Mustang appeared on his opposite flank, matching his glide with perfect precision. For a breath, Franz couldn't understand. They weren't firing. They weren't signaling him to bail out. They were simply there, holding formation with a dying aircraft. Then the lead Mustang pilot raised his hand. A simple point downward. Not a threat. A direction. Franz stared, frozen. Was he being mocked? Toyed with? But the gesture came again, steady, deliberate, urging him toward the American-held runway below 18,000 feet. 17.16.no bullets. No commands. Only silent escorts guiding him toward a place he had been told never to enter alive. As the ground rose to meet him, Franz's breath trembled. For the first time, doubt slipped into his fear. Maybe everything he had been told about his enemies was wrong. They moved before dawn. A thin fog crawled over the frozen ground as Pierre and Corporal Julian followed the narrow cattle trail toward the German outpost. The world felt painfully quiet, too quiet for men who were about to gamble with their lives. Pierre whispered, "No heroics. We get Mathilde, and we vanish." Julian nodded, gripping his rifle tight. He looked calm, but Pierre saw the tremor in his breath. They reached the ravine, a natural ditch carved by rain. Below them, barely 300 meters away, stood the outpost, 2 wooden barracks, a radio tent, a watchtower, and 3 patrolling guards. Julian whispered, 3 guards, good odds. Pierre shook his head, no. Good odds get men killed. We wait. Minutes crawled by. Then, just like Pierre predicted, one guard stepped inside to warm himself. Another went behind the barracks for a cigarette. Only one remained. Pierre tapped Julian's shoulder. Now. They slid down the ravine, boots silent on the wet soil. Every step felt heavier than war itself. A twig snapped under Julian's foot. the guard froze. Pierre didn't hesitate that he lunged from the shadows, covering the German's mouth and driving him silently to the ground. The struggle was quick. Quiet. Final. Julien exhaled shakily. You think Mathilde is inside? Pierre didn't answer. He was staring at the second-floor window of the barracks, a pale silhouette standing behind the glass. A woman, hair tied back, motionless, as if waiting. Julien whispered, Pierre, that's her. For the first time in days, Pierre felt something like hope, but hope can be dangerous, because at that exact moment, a voice shouted from the radio tent, then another, boots stomped against wooden floors, gun bolts clicked. Julien whispered, they know. Pierre knew what came next. The rescue had just become a siege. The silence shattered. A German soldier burst from the radio tent, yelling commands Pierre couldn't fully hear, but the message was clear. They had minutes. Maybe seconds. Julien grabbed Pierre's arm. We move now or we die here. Pierre sprinted toward the barracks, keeping low, boots hitting the frozen dirt with sharp, cold slaps. Julien covered him, firing 2 quick shots that forced the Germans to duck behind crates. Pierre slammed into the wooden door. It didn't budge. Another shot cracked past his ear. Splinters exploded from the doorframe. Julien yelled, Pierre, hurry. Pierre stepped back, planted his shoulder, and drove it into the door with everything he had left. It burst open. Inside, the room smelled of damp wool and smoke. Maps hung on the walls. A lantern burned low, and at the far end, tied to a chair, hands trembling, was Mathilde. Her eyes widened as she saw him. Not fear. Not confusion, recognition. Pierre, she whispered. He cut her ropes with a stolen bayonet, hands shaking harder than hers. Can you walk? Mathilde nodded, but her legs buckled when she stood. Pierre lifted her without hesitation. Outside, German voices grew louder, closing in from both sides. Julien burst into the doorway, breath ragged. They're surrounding the building. We're trapped. Pierre looked at the window, thin glass. A drop of 3 meters, snow below, not safe, but safer than staying. He kicked the window open, cold air blasted in. Julien understood instantly. Jump? Pierre nodded. We don't get another chance. Mathilde clung to Pierre's neck, her voice trembled. If we fall, Pierre cut her off gently, then we fall together. Behind them, boots thundered down the hallway, German rifles raised. Pierre didn't wait. He leaped. For a moment, one impossible, weightless moment, they hung in midair, and then everything slammed into white. The snow cushioned their fall, but not softly. Pierre hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his ribs as Mathilde rolled from his arms. She groaned but moved, alive. That was enough. Julien landed beside them with a sharp cry, clutching his ankle. Bullets punched through the window frame above, glass raining down like icy shards. Pierre pulled Mathilde close. Move. Into the trees. They ran, stumbling, limping, breath burning in their lungs. The camp alarms wailed behind them, echoing through the forest like a warning to the world. Pierre knew the terrain, thick pine trees, uneven ground, frozen roots hidden beneath the snow, perfect cover if they moved fast, perfect death trap if they hesitated. Julien struggled to keep pace, each step sinking deeper into the frost. I'm slowing you down. Pierre cut him off sharply. You're coming. That's final. Mathilde spoke softly, voice still unsteady. There's a river ahead. If it hasn't frozen, it leads toward the village. Pierre nodded. He remembered that river. Black water. Fast current, too cold for comfort, but cold wasn't the enemy today. Behind them, German voices grew clearer, hunting dogs barking, boots crushing snow. They didn't have long. They reached the riverbank, dark water slicing through the white landscape, steam rising from its surface like breath from a wounded animal. Julien stared at it with disbelief. We can't cross that. We'll freeze before we reach the other side. Pierre didn't argue. He knew the risk, but he also knew what stayed behind them. Mathilde held Pierre's sleeve. There's an old supply bridge a kilometer upstream. Wooden planks. Barely maintained. Pierre exhaled, forcing himself to think. The bridge was narrow, exposed. That if the Germans reached it first, they'd have no way across. Pierre tightened his grip on Julien's arm. We follow the river. Stay hidden under the ridge. For 20 agonizing minutes, they moved along the river's edge, the frozen bank collapsing under their boots. Branches whipped their faces. Ice cracked beneath them, every sound felt louder than it should have, every breath felt stolen. Mathilde stumbled at one point, collapsing to her knees. Pierre lifted her again without a second thought. Julien limped, falling behind, but forcing himself forward. When the bridge finally came into view, Pierre felt a punch of hope. A fragile wooden structure arcing over the water, unsteady, but real. Then Pierre froze. A silhouette stood on the far end of the bridge. A German officer, coat long, cap shadowing his face, rifle held loosely in his arms, waiting. Blocking their only escape, Julien whispered, "We're finished." But Pierre didn't lower his gaze. He stepped in front of Mathilde, shielding her. The officer stepped forward, snow crunching under his boots. He raised a hand, not to fire, but to signal something Pierre didn't understand yet, something that stopped even the wind. The officer's raised hand froze Pierre in place, not a threat, not a warning. A signal. Pierre tightened his grip on Mathilde's arm, pulling her slightly behind him. Julien steadied himself, jaw clenched, rifle held awkwardly against his injured ankle. The officer stepped closer, snowflakes collected on the brim of his cap, his breath fogged in the cold air. Pierre could finally see his face, young, pale, eyes sharp yet strangely hollow. Not the expression of a man eager to kill. He spoke quietly, voice carried by the river's wind, "You're late." Pierre didn't understand. Mathilde stared at the officer, confusion hardening into disbelief. "I know that voice." The officer removed his glove, lifting two fingers toward the tree behind Pierre. At once, the barking dogs went silent, the shouting stopped, not because the Germans had quit the chase, because someone had ordered them to. The officer turned back to Pierre. "If you want to live, cross the bridge. Now. Don't look back." Pierre didn't move. This could be a trap. A test. A final way to corner them. Pierre kept his stance firm. "Why are you helping us?" The officer's jaw tightened. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Because she shouldn't be here." His eyes moved to Mathilde. Pierre looked at her. Mathilde stepped forward, breath trembling. "Hans?" The name struck the air like a crack of ice. Julien whispered sharply, "You know him?" Mathilde nodded slowly, eyes locked on the officer. "Before the war, he studied music in Lyon. My brother knew him." Hans looked away as if the memory hurt to revisit. "I told your brother I would keep you safe if war ever touched you. I didn't think the promise would follow me here." Pierre felt the world narrow, forest, river, wind, all falling silent around the three of them. Julien leaned closer. "Pierre, we can't trust him." Pierre agreed, but time was bleeding away, and Hans had single-handedly stopped an entire German patrol. Mathilde's voice softened. "Why help us now? You could be executed." Hans gave a faint, broken smile. "Some debts outlive fear." He looked down the riverbank. "Your pursuers were ordered to turn east. For 5 minutes, you have no shadows." Hans pointed to the far end of the bridge. "Cross. Reach the forest on that side. There's a hunter's trail. Follow it until you see a burned oak. After that, you're on your own." Pierre placed a hand on Mathilde's back, urging her forward, but Hans raised his hand again, this time with a warning. "One more thing. There is a patrol station 2 kilometers ahead. If they find you before dawn, they won't ask questions." Pierre nodded. Mathilde stepped onto the bridge first. Pierre followed close behind, guiding Julien. The wood groaned beneath their weight. Halfway across, the river roaring below, Pierre glanced back. Hans hadn't moved. He stood alone at the edge of the bridge, rifle lowered, watching them leave. Then, a distant shout, boots crashing through snow. Another German patrol, not his men. Hans turned sharply toward the sound. Pierre felt the bridge shudder beneath him as the world erupted behind them. The shout behind them split the frozen air. Pierre didn't stop. Couldn't stop. He pushed Julien forward, guiding Mathilde across the swaying planks. The bridge trembled under every step, its ropes groaning like old wounds reopening. Another burst of gunfire erupted from the tree. Hans he was firing at the new patrol, holding them back. Mathilde flinched at every shot but kept moving, breath sharp, eyes fixed on the far end of the bridge. Julien nearly slipped, gripping the railing with a strained cry. "Pierre, hurry." Pierre steadied him, forcing his own fear down. The river roared beneath, cold mist rising like a warning from the depths. Halfway across, another volley of shots cracked through the forest. This time, closer. Pierre risked one glance back. Hans stood alone at the mouth of the bridge, firing in controlled bursts. Snow kicked up around him as German bullets struck the ground. He shouted, not at them, but to the approaching patrol, return to the camp. That's an order. They didn't obey. Hans fired again. A shot hit his shoulder. He staggered but stayed standing. Mathilde gasped, turning despite Pierre's attempt to shield her. Hans lifted his uninjured hand toward her in a small, almost gentle gesture, not telling her to return but telling her to keep going. Pierre tugged her urgently. Mathilde, look at me. Not behind. She forced herself forward. The far end of the bridge came into reach. Solid ground, deep pine shadows, a path that promised survival if they could just take a few more steps. Behind them, the gunfire intensified. Hans had knelt now, using the bridge post as cover, firing with grim determination. His coat darkened with spreading blood. Julien reached the end first, collapsing in the snow, panting through clenched teeth. Pierre pulled Mathilde the last few steps until her boots touched solid earth. He turned back. Hans was still fighting, still buying them time. Pierre hesitated, everything in him screamed to help, to turn back, to repay this impossible act of mercy, but then he remembered Hans's words, don't look back. A final burst of gunfire ripped through the trees. Hans slumped against the post. The Germans advanced, shouting, rifles raised. Pierre grabbed Mathilde's hand, voice low but firm, we go. Now. They slipped into the forest's shadow, moving along the hunter's trail exactly as Hans described. Snow muffled their steps. Branches scraped their coats. The world behind them faded into distance, shouts turning to echoes, echoes turning to silence. An hour later, breathless and shaking, they reached the burned oak. Its blackened trunk rose against the moonlight like a sentinel marking the edge of danger. Julien leaned against it, exhaustion overtaking him. Mathilde stood quietly, staring through the trees toward the direction they came from, not crying, just breathing, slow, steady, carrying the price of their escape within each breath. Pierre placed a hand on her shoulder. He kept his promise. Mathilde nodded, eyes glistening. Some debts truly outlive fear. The forest swallowed the horizon. Dawn crept slowly between the branches. They were free. But freedom had left a shadow behind them, and none of them would ever cross a bridge without remembering the man who stood alone so they could walk away.